Welcome to Unlocking Bach, audio program notes for upcoming concerts in Music Worcester's The Complete Bach. I'm Artistic Director Dr. Chris Shepard. Join me as we climb into the miraculous mind of Johann Sebastian Bach. Pretty grand music, isn't that? Welcome to this first Unlocking Bach, these audio program notes. And it's not grand music to celebrate the first episode, though it is pretty exciting to begin this on this 11-year journey. No, that is actually from one of the cantatas for the opening concert to be sung by CONCORA, a professional choir that I conduct in Hartford, Connecticut. And these three cantatas on this opening concert were written to celebrate the election of new town councils, two of them in the city of Leipzig, where Bach spent the final part of his life, and then the third from a small city called Mühlhausen, where he worked very early and also for a very short time in his life. These pieces are so grand, and we certainly in this particular day and age in America cannot exactly imagine celebrating elections with music like this. But this was very important. And why does it sound so regal? Why does it sound like it's music fit for a king? And in fact, when I talk about that cantata number 119 in a moment, you'll hear that in fact the music is fit for a king. It is because Mühlhausen in particular was what was known as an imperial free city, a Freireichsstadt in the Holy Roman Empire. Leipzig was not officially a free imperial city, but because it had extraordinary independence within the electorate of Saxony, we can think of it more like a free imperial city. And the important thing about these cities was that they were very jealous of this status that they had as something special. They did not answer to a duke or to a prince. They were independent and they answered directly to the emperor. This was a very important thing. Now, for our listeners here who will hear this concert in Hartford as opposed to Worcester, I just want you to imagine this. But those of us who know Mechanics Hall and Worcester, we are very used to seeing ringed around that beautiful concert space all these portraits of mostly men, although thanks to Kathy Gagne, the executive director of Mechanics Hall, they are no longer exclusively white or exclusively male, and we're so grateful for that. But those older portraits, a lot of them were just what might be called the city fathers, the town fathers. It's a very old expression, but it is an apt one, particularly in these cantatas from the 18th century. And many of them thought they were terribly important at the time, but they did not remain important over the centuries. I love that parallel because if you go to the City Hall in Leipzig, upstairs in what is now a museum, but was where the town council used to meet, it is the exact same thing. It is these portraits of the Bürgermeisters. You might know that from the wonderful claymation program at Christmas about Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, Meisterburger, Bürgermeister, which just really means a mayor or a town councilor. And they had such importance, and they had a particular importance in this era when government was something more akin to a theocracy. So the power of the town council and the rector and the staff of the church were combined. So they really were very, very busy. Why do we celebrate these town councils with these cantatas? Because they're really important in the repertoire of the cantatas and of Johann Sebastian Bach. There are certain themes that recur in the text. Imagine this, imagine that there's been an election, they're installing the new town council, Everybody goes to Thomaskirche, St. Thomas, for example, and there is just simply a service of thanksgiving asking to bless these church fathers. So you can imagine that it would be the same themes that come up over and over again in these religious-based texts. Essentially, thank you for keeping us prosperous. Thank you, Lord, for keeping us peaceful. Bless these men, always men, who will be looking after your people for their next term. The first two of the three of this concert are from his years in Leipzig, one very early and the other very late. And then we're going to look at BWV 71, which is hugely important in Bach's repertoire, and I will explain why. So what we're going to do in these Unlocking Bach episodes is to look at specific imagery in the music so that you can get a sense when you're listening to the music, what was in Bach's mind. As I love to say, we're going to climb inside Bach's mind and get some ideas. So that 119, you heard the beginning. He sets this as a song of praise. He sets it using the French overture style. Now, if you want to know what that is, why don't you find a recording of the third orchestral suite, and you will get a perfect example of it. It always starts with a lot of trumpets and timpani, a very big, regal, slow. You hear that, jam, pa pa, pa pa, with fanfares and flourishes, trumpets, and in this one, 4 trumpets. Very rare that Bach would use 4 trumpets in a cantata, but this is a very special cantata because he wrote it only 4 months after his arrival. As I said in Bach 101, Bach's relationship with the town council deteriorated over his years there. And what I love is that this cantata still seems hopeful that he can work well with them. The other one, you'll hear something a little bit different when I explain that. The French overture style begins, as I said, with that regal music, and then it always goes to something faster, often like a jig. Remember, I talked about the suites in an episode in Bach 101. Jig is fast, and it's ta-ta-ta-ti-ta-ta-ti-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. And this one sounds like this. This praise Jerusalem, praise Jerusalem the Lord. And so the great big introduction is only the orchestra, and then the choir comes in with this dancing, very joyful jig figure. And then, as is always true in a French overture, it returns at the end with a slight difference to that material from the beginning. So it is obvious when you hear this that yes, it's about praise. But let me tell you something you might not know, is that the French overture style was so closely associated with Louis XIV, with Louis XIV, that what we know is that Bach would have chosen this to represent kingship. So in much the same way that Americans are so closely hold this idea of the sovereignty of the people, what he's saying is, because Leipzig is like an imperial free city, we are like kings in this city, and the town council is quasi-royalty. So I think he was kind of kissing up to the town council early in his tenure there. It's a wonderful, wonderful movement. Let's go forward a couple movements to the arias, and I will typically do this when I talk about the cantatas. I will talk about the choruses, and I will talk about the arias. Usually the recitatives, they take care of themselves unless there are some specific images in there. This beautiful, beautiful movement is for tenor soloist and 2 oboes da caccia. These are those hunting oboes, and whenever Bach uses them, he is referring to something that is rustic. Well, what is rustic here is extremely obvious in the text, which says, "It is well for thee, people of the linden trees, that thou art well off." The word Leipzig, we think, came originally from the Slavic languages, meaning place of the linden trees. So this whole movement Bach is referring to that idea. So he's using the hunting, the outdoor oboes, which in modern instruments we play on the English horn. He also uses an affect that feels like pastoral music. Let me just play the opening of this. So it's a duet between two oboes, between two English horns. You hear that yum be da da da. When you think of the dum ba dim ba di dim dum ba dim da, it's a slight sense of a Siciliano. So he's setting it outside under the linden trees, and I think even this is almost like the waving of the leaves in the breeze. And then this well-being that the tenor sings of, he begins on this beautiful long note coming out of the oboes. And then he just continues in the same way that the oboes have been going. It is a really beautiful, very pastoral, quite simple. I mean, Bach is never simple, right? It's always difficult to sing. But the idea and the feeling behind it is simple. Now, I said that I don't often talk about recitatives in these, but I have to talk about the next one because there are two ideas in it. The first half, the bass sings, "How glorious is your position, Leipzig, your people whom God has chosen for his inheritance." So the first part of it is about the gloriousness of Leipzig. But then the second half talks about the people being blessed. So what does Bach do? I love this. He opens with a trumpet fanfare. With a very stentorian bass voice, "Es ist der Herr der alte Welt," a fanfare, a vocal fanfare of sorts. But then when we talk about the blessing, Bach changes instead to use the woodwinds, the flutes and the oboes, in long chords over the bass part. Sort of a shimmering sense of blessedness. It's really quite wonderful, and finishes with the trumpet fanfare. The aria that follows is for alto with flute. Now, originally, these were recorders. Because we're using modern instrument in this particular performance, we are going to use a flute solo. And it's very beautiful. Have a listen to this. Sorry. Isn't that just beautiful? It has such a lovely flowing nature to it. The text for this is, "Government is God's great gift." So it's a blessing aria when the alto comes in. It's just really, really lovely. And we have this little flute pattern of repeated notes. Which is wonderful, and maybe that is the idea of that authority, that even though it's flute, it has a sense of status to it. It's a beautiful, beautiful aria, and right there, by the way, is in that aria this sense of theocracy, because the message behind it is that God's authority is civic authority, and that might put us off in the 20th century in America, but certainly not in Germany, certainly not in Lutheran Germany. Then the final chorus, which is really just terrific. This is all about the idea that God supports and blesses the town fathers. Listen to this text. "He gazes upon our faithful fathers and supports them in untold and long-lasting years in the house of their government." How does Bach show this? Well, there's a whole section that is that text, which is about the town fathers. But then he finishes with a fugue setting the text, the Lord has done good to us, therefore all of us are joyful. And often this idea of all of us, alle, sind wir alle uns, all of us, a fugue is a great way to set the words all of us because it is passed around from section to section. So all of us over here believe this, all of us over there believe this, all of us together believe it. And it is a wonderful, really quite simple fugue subject. The basses start with it. It goes like this. Der Herr hat gut an uns getan. That's all. Der Herr hat gut an uns getan. So there's not much to it. It's even a little bit stentorian itself. And then the contrast, moving around a lot. So it comes together. It is sung by the voices alone, and then the orchestra enters. And it is just one of those absolutely beautiful Bach fugues. So that's from the beginning of Bach's time in Leipzig, when he still liked his bosses. And then he had to produce one near the end. This one, BWV 120, could not be any earlier than 1742. And he died in 1750, so it's from sometime in the last 8 years of his life. We don't know exactly when, but we do know that it has to be late. And we think that it is probably taken from some cantata movements that have been lost since. We call this parody. So not parody like SNL, but parody that you take an original and you give a new life to it. For example, the B minor Mass is full of parodies. So we don't look down our nose at parodies. We're not ashamed to reuse material. Something I just find a little funny about it, because he did not like the church fathers at this point. I like the fact that he said, I'll just reuse material that I've used before, whereas he took such great care in 119. That does not mean, however, that this is not great music. It is. He chose well from music that he had composed before, but we think it's probably not original. Something else really interesting about BWV 120. More often than not, if there is a choir in a cantata, Bach will begin with a movement for the choir. He does not do that here. He begins with what I think is one of the most beautiful and yet one of the most vocally challenging arias, in this case for the alto voice. The text here is about praising God in the stillness of Zion. So two opposing ideas, and Bach loved his contrasts. So we have to ask ourselves, what will the contrast be here? So we know that he's going to want to represent the stillness, but then also represent the praise. Let me show you. The continuo, this is the double bass and the cello with the organ at the very beginning. They do this wonderful little figure that imagine 6 notes, but with a rest on the first 16th. It's this, the rest itself can represent peace in the sense that you're not doing anything on there. It's ba 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 ba, and even this figure ba 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 ba, which cannot ever sound good enough on piano, on cello and bass, tia da da di da, tia da da di da. It has a sort of breathiness to it. The strings are above, and the oboe d'amore. We just talked about the oboe da caccia. The oboe da caccia is for the outside. The oboe d'amore. If the oboe da caccia, the English horn, is a tenor oboe, the oboe d'amore is a mezzo-soprano, is an alto oboe. It was only used a little bit in the Baroque period and almost never again afterwards. It is almost exclusively these days associated with Johann Sebastian Bach. And he used it very specifically to get the color that he wanted, which was a little bit richer than oboe. It's a little bit lower than oboe, but also that word amore, which of course means love. He would often use it to represent God's love for his people. So we have this lovely figure from them in the beginning, the oboes and the violins together. Which is already very pretty, but you know what else he does to it? He adds staccati. And then you add that to the... Isn't that just beautiful? And it really does set up this expectation of stillness. And then the oboes run away. This is what they do going on. I think this is the praise. And then you've just got to hear on the oboes. It's just fantastic. Second oboe, this running figure. So he really does combine this sense of stillness and sense of praise in the orchestra. And then listen to what the alto does when they come in. This is just really crazy. Isn't that just incredible how fast that is? That's hard enough to play on piano, much less sing. These have 3 flags to them, so they are 30-second notes all the way through there. So the fireworks, that's in the alto voice. So that is certainly the praise. So wonderful, wonderful, quite monumental opening movement. And then, as if it couldn't get more monumental, we have the second movement, and here you get that chorus of praise that we come to expect. This is jauchzet, shout with joy, you joyous voices. And see if you recognize this from the beginning. If that sounds familiar, it is because that is the same music as the et expecto from the B minor Mass. So in a sense, this is a double parody, that this came from an earlier model, but then the et expecto came either from that earlier model as well or from this. And this shout for joy is all these upward figures in the choir. It's really tricky to sing, but it's wonderful. They do things like the ya, ha, 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 it is just wonderful. It is also very florid and difficult to sing. For example, here is the alto part a little bit later on their own. And all of the parts have that. The trumpets and timpani come in. So we begin with the stillness plus praise, then unadulterated praise. And then what does he do with this beautiful aria that is for soprano and strings, but not just strings, strings with a violin solo on top of it. And I'll tell you something, I'm not even going to try to play this violin solo because it is just as florid, has just as many of those 30-second notes as the alto did in the beginning. So we're getting this sense, aren't we, from this cantata 120, that the idea of praise is so important and that Bach bakes that in through the use of these fast-moving notes. And yet, the piece itself is not particularly fast except for the florid violin solo part. So listen to this. It's even simpler when the soprano comes in, less florid. Isn't that just beautiful? Dee-dum-bum, dee-dum-bum. I think that this resembles more than any other dance form a minuet. And remember from Bach 101, when I talked about minuets are about balance. So let's look at the text and see if we find balance here. Well, the text is this. They're the words Heil und Segen. And this means health and blessing. And the translation is this: health and blessing shall and must at all times upon our government come in desired measure. So I think that what this text is saying is that you need both health, which you might think of as well-being, and God's blessing, and they need to be in proper balance. So I think that by using the minuet, Bach is saying this about the balance. I also think that the more, again, I always hate to use the word simple with Bach because it's just never ever simple to perform. But that melody for the soprano is certainly less florid than, and forgive me, Bach, for what is about to come out of my fingers. This is just the one little section of the violin part. Or even harder. So let's say that that right there is the giddiness of good health. I think that that's what the violin is, the giddiness of ruddy good health, whereas the soprano part, which has a simpler contour and phrasing to it, is the blessing. And they need to be held in equipoise. Because if you have too much of that florid stuff, then we're going to run away with that sense. And so it needs to be balanced by that blessing. But if it's too much blessing, well then maybe government will be too staid, and we don't want that either. Those are the two Leipzig cantatas that he wrote for town council elections. As I said, number 71, Gott ist mein König, is hugely important for a number of reasons. It comes from very early in his life. This was composed in 1708. So let's do the math together. He was 23 years old. He was working in Mühlhausen, one of the imperial free cities. Here's a fascinating thing. There were only 2 scores of cantatas that were published in Bach's lifetime. And this was one of them. The other was also from Mühlhausen and was also a town council election. Remember what I said about those imperial free cities. They were very proud of their status and they were very jealous about guarding that status. So it perhaps is not surprising. The town council did not publish this to aggrandize Bach. They published it to aggrandize themselves and to say, look at us in Mühlhausen, that we can celebrate our town council like this. This cantata is also hugely important because in many different ways, it is much more related to North German music, and particularly the music of Dietrich Buxtehude, than it is that amalgamation of French, Italian, and German style that I talk about so much in Bach 101. So we get to see in a more unadulterated form the way that he was inspired by those composers, and particularly by Buxtehude. Bach went on a trip to Lübeck, which is where Buxtehude worked, and hearing Gott ist mein König, we can certainly hear how he could have heard Buxtehude. And these are the ways. So Buxtehude's church had a lot of different balconies and galleries. And so he would put different, what we call choirs, in those galleries to make a polychoral effect. Now by choir, I don't just mean choir of singers. In this period, you could use the word choir to mean a collection. So a choir of trumpets, a choir of recorders, a choir of oboes, and so on and so forth. And then you use the acoustic of the space to fill that out. And so we're going to go through 71 now, BWV 71, and I'm going to tell you the ways in which these sections are so much like what Buxtehude would do. Let me begin, though, by making a general statement. The music is much more sectional within a movement. So you get changes of meter. You might go from 3/2 to 4/4 to 6/8, and there are also changes of tempo. Those changes were governed by rules of what equaled what. For example, an eighth note pulse in one section might become the half note pulse in the next section, so that to the listener, there is a cohesiveness to the entire movement. But I'll tell you something, as the performer and as the conductor, you need to know exactly what you're going to do in those shifts. Can I show you a couple of those shifts? This is in the last movement. We'll talk about the chorus later. It begins, for example, in a sort of pompous 4. It's in 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, but then it shifts to 3. So let me just go from one bar of 4 to one bar of 3. And 1, 2, 1 and 2, and 1, 2. So 1 and 2 and 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. So although it sounds like it's a really big change, let me do that again. So 1, 2, 1, 2. It sounds very different because the metrical pulse is so different. Let me show you one more section of that just so you can see what I mean. And in this section, he changes more quickly between these. It begins with that pompous 4 that we were just doing, and then it goes still in 4, but simply to a faster tempo. 1 and 2. Da 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 1. 1 and 2. So it's the same meter, 4/4, but a different feel. And then that goes into a 3/2. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that is a very typical shift in the music of Buxtehude, to go between 4 and 3. It is not typical in the music of Bach. It's not unheard of, but it's really not typical. So if you began by knowing Monteverdi's Vespers, for example, or music by Buxtehude, and then you heard this, you'd say, wow, that doesn't really sound like Bach. It's because it's very early. The text for this is Psalm 74. Now, I really love this and I find it really funny because the new mayor, the principal burgomaster, was 83 years old. Can you imagine a country having an election between people that are in their 80s? Maybe put that to one side. The new principal mayor was 83, which in that period would have been really the equivalent of 95 or 100. And his colleague was 70. And so isn't it funny that Bach chose, or whoever chose, we can't quite know who chose the text, chose this text that is about old age. For example, I am now 80 years old. Why shall your servant burden himself any more? I will turn back so that I may die in my city, my gray hair with honor. It certainly sounds, doesn't it, like they face their old age with a real sense of reality, because otherwise that mayor might be quite unhappy with that text. And in another movement, may your old age be like your youth, and God is with you in everything that you do. I really do love that. I think that is quite funny and a little poignant too, isn't it? So one other way in which the Buxtehude style was not like Bach's cantatas after he left this part of Germany is that Buxtehude didn't necessarily write long arias the way that we find in those other Bach cantatas, for example. So I'm not going to spend much time in this case talking about the arias because they're quite short. But I do want to talk about the choruses. They are in this, not surprisingly, in this town council election cantata, mostly choruses of praise, but I have to talk to you about this extraordinary chorus that is not a chorus of praise. It is totally different. And the text is this: you would not give the soul of your turtle dove to the enemy. Now, the turtle dove we think of, first of all, as romantic love or marital love. But in fact, it also meant the faithful love between God and humanity, and also innocence and purity. This movement, when you hear it in the concert, will kind of blow your mind because of the way that he has used the orchestra. And this is typical of these very early cantatas. He used the orchestra and its variegated colors in ways that we don't always see later in his career, particularly in the choruses. So he has these different choirs that we've talked about. One is the oboes with bassoon, and we have a written out bassoon part. Quite rare, and usually only in the early works do we find that. And they sound, so this is 1 and 2, and in the organ, it's even marked staccato. So holding all of it together is that organ part, but then you get against that this bassoon part. Can I remind you that any repeating pattern like that is called an ostinato. And Bach builds up the texture of this movement by using ostinati, which is the plural of ostinato. We can say ostinatos as well. So there's an ostinato, a very simple one, in the organ, but then you add to that the bassoon, and I'm going to put the oboes on top. So that is a more sighing figure. Dum tia da dum, almost like the cooing of a bird, right? Almost like a turtle dove. And the choir is almost always just in those block chords with the melody on top. This is a gorgeous, shimmering, beautiful movement. And it will surprise you. I don't think you will associate it so much with the music of Bach. The cello, by the way, has these arpeggiated figures as well. So when you pile it all together, it's a little bit like Philip Glass. It's a little bit like minimalism, that you get this image that I often like to use, which is a mobile over a baby's crib, that as it circulates, the light glints differently off different aspects. But as I said, it is also about these choruses of praise. For example, in that opening movement, God is my king from long ago, Gott ist mein König, who assists all that exist on the earth. Immediately you'll hear these trumpet fanfare, like, even when it's not trumpet, although in the very beginning it is. Oboes, choir, Gott ist mein König, strings. So you get that sense straight away, a bunch of fanfares, and he doesn't care who. The oboes have a fanfare, the flutes have a fanfare. And even when you see this on the score, he has set this up in choirs. So it's trumpets with timpani, it's flutes, originally recorded with cello, so that is one choir. He's not separating out the bass part. Each choir gets its own bass instrument, the oboes with the bassoon. And all the way through, you're going to hear how it alternates, and he will focus on different choirs, including the sung choir at different times. And not only is there a sung choir, but there is one more choir to take into consideration. And this is a huge hint for us about how Bach may have performed many, if not most, if not all, of his cantatas. And it is this: he has delineated sections that say senza ripieni, without the fillers in. The ripieno, you would have a quartet of singers. Sometimes in that period it was called the coro favoriti, the favorites, who sing on their own, and then when you add others, that is the ripieno. So he has contrast even within the choir. He'll have the whole choir sing and then a quartet. And the reason why I say it might be a hint that tells us about more of how Bach performed his music is, remember what I said, this is the only printed score. And when you print a score, you put in every possible marking because it's going to be distributed to people who don't know how you do things in Mühlhausen or in Leipzig. So it is possible, and the argument has been made, and I myself have performed some of Bach's music like this, that you should extrapolate from ideas. The principal idea being this: in a fugue, the concertato group, the quartet of soloists, should do the first iteration of the fugue subjects on their own, and then you add the others, the ripieno, after that. This helps to build this scale and texture of a fugue movement. And then the other thing that's very interesting is that for that first entry, almost never in a cantata does Bach double the singers in the first round of it with instruments. They're very often on their own with the continuo, but then the instruments enter as if to say, let's support these singers because they might be a little bit weaker. It is a wonderful debate that has gone on since the 1980s, sometimes, by the way, very contentiously. Bach does something very interesting, and again, you think, wow, where else might you apply this? There's an entire movement, the third movement, that is marked for the quartet. Tenor starts and then bass. Soprano. And if that sounds a little bit sober and dour, I think it's meant to be. I think it's referring to the old style that was prevalent in North Germany. And that's the text. May your old age be like your youth, and God is with you in everything that you do. I really love this. Dein Alter sei wie deine Jugend. That's, may your old age be like your youth. As if he's using a Beatles melody for somebody who's now in their 70s to say, oh yeah, this is music from your childhood. Well, that kind of writing style was from the childhood of somebody who was 80 years old. And then when it says, and God is with you in everything you do, you get something that's much more florid. And when we hear that kind of moving around, that often represents God's activity in our lives. So it's nice little images. I'm hoping that you're finding these to be things that might have passed you by just by listening. Then finally, that wonderful last movement, some of which I'd played for you. So the salient fact of the last movement is that it changes a lot. This is about blessing this new regime, the new town council, with peace, with quiet, and with good health. He mentions, the librettist mentions Joseph I, who was the emperor, who's still a couple years left in his life at this point. And the text is, happiness, health, and great conquest must newly and daily delight you, Joseph, so that all lands and places may constantly enjoy happiness, health, and great conquest. The thing to note in that is important is it is addressed directly to the emperor. And why? Because the imperial free city town councilors were extremely proud of the fact that they answered to the emperor, to no one else. So I'm not really surprised that Joseph got a mention. I want to show you this beautiful, again, fugue that begins without the ripieni and then builds bit by bit, because this is the text, the exact text. Must delight thee each new day, Joseph. And this idea of the blessings and the happiness building on itself. Well, it's perfect, isn't it, for a fugue, because a fugue builds on itself. And this also, incidentally, it's in 3/2. That meter is very much an early to mid-Baroque time signature, not so much later. That also helps us to place this in a time. So just have a listen to this. It's a very beautiful fugue subject, not particularly complicated. Di diadam pa ti-ya-dum, be ti-ya-dum, bim pa. That has a little bit of a dance feel to it too, doesn't it? And then the alto comes in. Tenor. And then the bass. And the whole thing just builds on itself, but in a way that is so much more about blessing. And then at the end, we get one more of those shifts. Glück Heil, which just means fortune and prosperity, and then großer Sieg, great victory. So definitely a praisey ending. And then, I don't want to spoil it for you, but I do want you to be listening for it. He does the oddest thing, and if you can tell me what it means, I would love to know, because I'm not quite sure. At the very end of this whole movement, which is about glory, he finishes with the flutes in unison. So this Glück Heil, this prosperity and health, bum beep, that figure, leading to it is just very, very big orchestra and choir. And then the flutes just end so do, and in fact, it goes like this: strings, bumpy, oboe, bum, bum, flute, bum, bum. And I wonder, I don't know, is it the band packing up and walking away? Is it a procession that goes off somewhere? Is it saying the town councilors, now it's time to get to work, so they've left and are going to their offices? I don't know, but I remain very open to hearing from anybody who has a great idea. Oh, here we go, everybody. At the end of this concert, one down, 131 to go. I cannot wait to actually make music and hear all of this great music and meet all of you. Come say hi after the concert. So that's it for now. The first concert of Bachtoberfest weekend 2024. I will be back because we have so much unlocking Bach to do together. See you next time.